Realize being in a place where every decision, every action, every word whispered in the shadows could change the course of history. The year is 1775, and the air is thick with tension. People are divided, and whispers of rebellion echo in the streets. The Revolutionary War is on the horizon, and the fate of an entire nation hangs in the balance. But how did it all begin? What drove ordinary men and women to take on the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? Today, we're diving deep into the birth of the United States, the Revolutionary War, an epic struggle for freedom and independence that changed the world forever. Let's rewind to the early 1700s. The American colonies were growing rapidly, 13 distinct colonies, each with its own culture, economy, and way of life. But despite their differences, they had one thing in common: they were all under British rule. At first, things were pretty peaceful. The colonists were proud British subjects, but as the colonies grew, so did their irritation. The British Empire was vast and powerful, but it was also expensive to maintain. The crown needed money, and where did they turn to get it? The American colonies. Taxes were slapped on everything from sugar to stamps, paper to tea. But here's the catch: the colonists had no say in the matter. No taxation without representation, they cried. It wasn't just about the money. It was about being heard, about having a voice in decisions that affected their lives. Tensions boiled over, and soon, protests turned into something much more dangerous. Secret meetings, underground pamphlets, and growing unrest. The colonists were angry, but they were also scared. Speaking out against the crown was treason, and the punishment for treason? Death. But the spirit of rebellion was like wildfire, spreading fast, unstoppable, and burning with the desire for freedom. Then, in 1770, the unthinkable happened. British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonial in Boston, killing 5. The Boston Massacre. Blood had been spilled, and there was no turning back. The seeds of discontent had been sown, and the harvest was revolution. By 1773, the situation was like a powder keg, ready to explode, and that explosion came in the form of tea. The British imposed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. To the colonists, it was another example of British tyranny, but this time they had a plan, a bold, defiant plan. On a cold December night, a group of colonists changed as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They weren't there to steal or fight. They were there to send a message. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the icy waters, a daring act of defiance that would go down in history as the Boston Tea Party. King George III was furious. This wasn't just about tea, it was about control. The crown responded with the coercive axe, known by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed, and British soldiers flooded the city. It was martial law, and the colonists were pushed to their breaking point. In 1774, the colonies had had enough. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. They didn't all agree on what to do, but they knew something had to change. They sent a petition to the king asking for their rights to be respected, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The king wasn't interested in compromise. He wanted obedience. As winter turned to spring in 1775, tensions reached a boiling point. The British were preparing to crush the rebellion before it could truly begin, but the colonists were ready. They had formed militias, ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, training in secret, ready to defend their homes and their freedom. And then, on April 19, 1775, it happened. The first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired in the small towns of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. But how did it come to this? Let's set the stage. The British had gotten wind of a cache of colonial weapons hidden in Concord. General Thomas Gage, the British commander, decided it was time to act. He sent 700 redcoats to seize the weapons and arrest key colonial leaders. The plan was to move quickly and strike before the colonists could react. But there was one thing: the British didn't count on the patriots' spy network. As the British marched through the night, Paul Revere and other riders were already on the move, spreading the alarm. The British are coming. The British are coming. The message raced across the countryside, and by the time the redcoats reached Lexington at dawn, they found 77 militiamen waiting for them on the village green. It was a standoff. The British ordered the militia to disperse, and for a moment, it seemed like the bloodshed might be avoided. But then, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but that single shot echoed through history. The shot heard round the world. Chaos erupted. The British opened fire, and the first American blood was spilled. The British pushed on to Concord, but by the time they arrived, the colonial militias had regrouped. At North Bridge, the Americans took a stand, firing the first shots in defense of their homes. The British were forced to retreat back to Boston, harried all the way by colonial snipers and militia. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, it was clear that this wasn't just a local skirmish. It was a war. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, and this time all 13 colonies were represented. The big question on everyone's mind, what now? They decided to form a continental army, and to lead it, they chose a tall, imposing figure, George Washington. Washington was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and he was a man who commanded respect. But leading an army of untrained farmers and shopkeepers against the might of the British Empire, that was a tall order. Not everyone was ready to declare independence. Many delegates still hoped for reconciliation. They sent the olive branch petition to King George III, a last-ditch effort to avoid full-scale war. But the king wasn't interested. He declared the colonies in open rebellion, and that meant one thing: war was inevitable. The war that followed was brutal, bloody, and far from certain. The British were well-trained, well-equipped, and disciplined. The Americans, they were underdogs in every sense. But they had something the British didn't. Their backs were against the wall. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their very way of life. As the war raged on, a new idea began to take hold: independence. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was a fiery call for independence, and it spread like wildfire. Paine argued that it was absurd for an island to rule a continent, and that the time had come for the colonies to break free from British rule. The idea of independence was no longer radical, it was becoming the only option. And on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress made it official. The Declaration of Independence was signed. 13 colonies united as one, declaring their independence from Britain. The stakes had never been higher. But declaring independence was one thing, winning it was another. The British weren't going to let their colonies go without a fight, and they fought hard. The early years of the war were brutal for the Americans. They faced defeat after defeat, struggling to hold the line. The British captured New York City in 1776, dealing a devastating blow to the American cause. Washington's army was on the run, outnumbered and outgunned. And then came the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge. It was one of the darkest times for the Continental Army. They were cold, hungry, and barely holding on. Disease and starvation took their toll, and morale was at rock bottom. But even in the darkest times, there was hope. Washington's leadership was crucial. He kept his men together, instilling in them a sense of purpose, a belief that their cause was just. And as winter turned to spring, the army began to turn a corner. The Americans weren't alone in their struggle. France, eager to see Britain weakened, began to provide crucial support. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman, became one of Washington's most trusted generals, and Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, trained the Continental Army at Valley Forge, turning them into a more disciplined fighting force. The tide began to turn with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. It was a major turning point, proving to the world that the Americans could win. This victory convinced France to formally join the war as an ally to the United States. French troops, ships, and resources flowed into the fight, giving the Americans a much-needed boost. The war spread beyond the northern colonies. The British shifted their focus to the south, hoping to rally loyalists and crush the rebellion there. But the American resistance was fierce. Battles raged across the Carolinas and Georgia, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The war wasn't just fought on land. The seas became a battleground as well. American privateers, essentially pirates with a government license, attacked British ships, disrupting their supply lines. And the fledgling American Navy, though small, managed to score some significant victories. One of the most famous naval battles was led by John Paul Jones. Aboard the Bonhomme Richard, he engaged the British warship Serapis in a fierce battle. When asked if he was ready to submission, Jones famously replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." His victory became a symbol of American resolve. As the war dragged on, both sides were weary. But the Americans had one last, great victory up their sleeves. The year was 1781, and the stage was set for the final, decisive battle of the Revolutionary War, Yorktown. British General Lord Cornwallis had dug in at Yorktown, Virginia, waiting for reinforcements. But what he didn't know was that the American and French forces were closing in fast. Washington and Lafayette led the American troops, while French General Rochambeau brought reinforcements from the north. And from the sea, the French Navy blocked any hope of British escape. The siege of Yorktown was relentless. For weeks, the American and French forces bombarded the British defenses, tightening the noose around Cornwallis's neck. The British tried to break out, but it was too late. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of supplies. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. It was the moment the Americans had fought so hard for. The war wasn't officially over. There were still skirmishes, and peace negotiations dragged on, but the victory at Yorktown broke the British will to fight. The American Revolution had been won. After 8 long years of war, Peace finally came in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. The British recognized American independence, and a new nation was born. But this wasn't just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a grand experiment in democracy. A nation built on the ideals of liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. The challenges weren't over. The new United States faced the daunting task of building a government from scratch. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt, proved too weak. So in 1787, delegates met again in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, a document that would lay the foundation for a government by the people, for the people. George Washington became the nation's first president, leading a country that was still finding its way. The years ahead would be filled with challenges, internal strife, foreign threats, and the struggle to live up to the ideals set forth in the Revolution. But the dream of a free and independent nation had been realized. The Revolutionary War wasn't just about battles and victories. It was about an idea, a belief that people could govern themselves, that freedom was worth fighting for. And that idea didn't just change America, it changed the world. From the blood-soaked fields of Lexington to the victorious surrender at Yorktown, the story of the American Revolution is one of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. Today, the United States stands as a testament to the vision and bravery of those who fought in the Revolutionary War. Their legacy lives on in the freedoms we enjoy, the rights we hold dear, and the democratic principles that continue to guide the nation. But it's also a reminder that freedom is never free. It's something that must be fought for, protected, and cherished. The Revolutionary War was a time of great peril, but also of great possibility. It was a time when normal people did extraordinary things. So as we look back on the founding of the United States, let's remember the lessons of the past and carry forward the spirit of the revolution, the belief in a better, freer future. Thanks for joining us on this informational journey through history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of history.